What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
On Sunday, right after the prayer ended and before anyone even passed the bread, my mother looked across the table at me with that sharpness in her eyes she reserves for moments when she wants to cut deep, and she said, very clearly and without even blinking, that I would never be as pretty or as successful as my sister. It was not a slip, not something muttered under her breath or said in jest, but a deliberate statement dropped into the silence of a family meal, as if she had rehearsed it all week. Nobody moved, nobody said a thing. The clinking of silverware stopped for a second, and then, as if on cue, everyone tried to carry on with the food while I sat there feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. I did the only thing I know how to do in those moments. I gathered plates, stacked them quietly, carried them to the sink, and left without a word, not because I was calm, but because I have learned that my silence unsettles her more than any shouting ever could. The drive home was long, with the windows cracked enough to let in the chill, and the same streets I had driven since I was 16 suddenly felt hostile, like they were keeping secrets I should have uncovered long ago. I gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, not crying, not yelling, just running inventory in my head of all the little ways I had been carrying more than my share for years. My father used to say that when someone tries to define you with a single sentence, you have two choices: accept it or dismantle it. So, I began dismantling, not by arguing with her, but by pulling away the threads she had woven into me for decades. That night, sitting in my apartment with the glow of the kitchen light making everything look harsher than it was, I pulled up all the accounts I had been quietly paying. The family phone line that had my name on it, the one she always acted like was hers by right, I shut it off. The streaming accounts she complained about when they buffered, I changed the password and locked them down. Then I placed fraud alerts across every credit bureau, because if there is one thing I know about my mother, it is that her talent for getting what she wants does not stop at words. It extends into paperwork, signatures, and favors that no one else questions. I was not going to give her another inch of my name to play with. Around midnight my phone buzzed with a message from Ava. Call me. Mom's crying and won't say why. It figured. Mom's tears have always been her sharpest tool. The way she redirects blame and gathers sympathy before anyone can question what she actually did. I didn't call, not because I didn't care, but because I had seen this performance too many times, and I wasn't about to hand her the satisfaction of comforting her for something she caused. Instead, I muted the conversation, poured myself a cup of tea, and tried to quiet the buzzing in my head. When I got downstairs the next morning, the doorman slid a clipboard across the counter with a certified envelope sitting on top. The return address was from the same bank that had once handled my father's trust, and the sight of it made my stomach drop. I signed, carried it upstairs, and laid it on the table without opening it for a long while, as though the paper might burn through if I wasn't careful. My father always believed in paper trails, in evidence you could hold in your hands, and I told myself this might be another one of those maps he used to leave us, the kind that revealed the truth when you were ready for it. But when I finally tore the flap, the reality was colder. A notice about a delinquent line of credit tied to the family house, a line that bore my name even though I had never touched it. My name was being used, again, and this time the stakes weren't some shared utility bill, but the roof of the house where we had grown up. I closed my eyes and pictured my mother standing at that sink, drying her hands on a towel before dropping her sentence at the table, like she had been waiting for the perfect moment to remind me where she believed I belonged. I knew then that leaving quietly had been the right choice, because it gave me room to move in silence, to play the game she never imagined I had the patience for. I made two lists, facts on one side, questions on the other. Fact: a line of credit existed. Fact: the house was collateral. Question: who signed my name? Question: how many times had this been done before without me noticing? Before the night was over, I had called the bank and started the tedious process of tracing the account, and I had spoken to a clerk in the county office who told me exactly what I needed to file to put a hold on any title transfers involving my name. She was blunt, not particularly friendly, but I trusted her more than I trusted my own blood at that moment. That was my first real act of revenge, not slamming doors or screaming into the phone, but freezing the ground beneath her feet so she couldn't keep moving pieces around in the dark. I went to bed with the certified notice tucked into a folder on my desk, the fraud alerts in place, and the accounts she relied on locked out from under her. And just as I was drifting off, my phone lit up again with an alert from the property record system, a flag tied to my name and that house. The subject line was only one word, printed in capital letters like it wanted to mock me. Urgent. The county building greeted me with the shine of overused floor cleaner and a bulletin board layered with notices that looked like they had been posted and forgotten by people who came here already tired. And as I took a number and watched it flick upward with an indifference I envied, I felt something steady inside me click into place. Not triumph or anger, but a kind of clean focus that I had not accessed in years because I had always been busy translating my mother's moods into manageable tasks. When my number finally blinked at the window, I laid out the certified notice, my affidavit challenging any signature that pretended to be mine, and the dull pencil the clerk handed me felt like a gavel because with every line I filled in, I took back a square of ground from a battlefield I had not realized stretched under my entire life. The clerk, a woman with the patience of a librarian and the vigilance of a border guard, explained in a voice that did not rise or fall that in administrative hold could be placed to stall any title movement until identity questions were verified, and even though she called it routine and warned me not to mistake it for a final shield, the sound of her rubber stamp landing on the page felt like a door somewhere far down a hallway clicking shut in my favor. I texted Ava to meet at the coffee shop near the church because I wanted a neutral place and because some part of me wanted her to feel the odd gravity of being within sight of the cross that our mother invoked whenever she wanted to win an argument she had no business winning. And when Ava walked in wearing sunglasses under a sky the color of dishwater, she gave me a hug that lasted exactly 1 second too short to be sincere, then ordered something iced and sweet and took a sip that left foam on her lip the way a child leaves proof of the cookie they were not supposed to eat. She opened with the line I expected, telling me that Mom had not slept and that her hands shook and that the house felt cold even with the oven on, and I nodded, because I have learned you let the preface unspool before you ask for the index. And then I slid the notice across the table with 2 fingers and waited while Ava skimmed, not reading the way people do when they want to absorb meaning, but scanning the way people do when they are searching for one sentence to use as a raft. She said, soft and rushed and conspicuously vague, that Mom had only moved a few things around when Dad got sick, that the terms had been better under my credit, that it was temporary and harmless and part of a larger plan to keep the house in the family. And I listened to each word land like a bead on a string that I recognized from 100 prayers spoken at 100 family dinners where the moral was always that sacrifice looked best on me. I asked her, in a voice I kept warm because warmth calms skittish animals, whether she knew about any pending title changes, whether Mom had floated the idea of placing the house in Ava's name with a life estate that sounded generous, but functioned like a trap. And Ava's laugh arrived a second too late and a shade too bright, after which she looked at the window and admitted that, yes, there had been a conversation about security for her boutique and how the house could serve as an anchor while she rebuilt after the slow season, and that Mom had said I would not mind because I was practical and independent and not sentimental about the property. I swallowed what I wanted to say about how independence is often just the receipt for the help you never got, and I opened my phone and filed a supplemental fraud alert that required original wet ink copies for any lien, any line, any move involving my name. Then I emailed the bank's records department and insisted on a certified statement of signature provenance, and I CC'd a personal address I use for projects I do not trust, because experience has taught me redundancy is not just belt and suspenders, it is a parachute you hope you never need. Ava leaned forward, her voice dropping as if secrets only count when whispered, and told me that Mom had been pacing the kitchen at 3 in the morning repeating that I did not understand what Dad left or why, that there were complications, that I always turned everything into a trial as if truth were a courtroom and love a witness that needed prompting, and I almost laughed, because if love had ever been a witness in our house, Mom would have objected to its tone. I told Ava, gently and with enough humor to keep her seated, that I was not turning anything into a trial. I was simply returning the paperwork to the daylight where it belonged, and that if Mom had nothing to hide, she would be grateful for my thoroughness. A line that made Ava flinch because even she could not pretend gratitude lived in our mother's vocabulary. When we stood to leave, I executed the kind of revenge my mother never sees coming because it wears no glitter and generates no gossip, the kind that happens in office lighting with bad coffee and a clock that clicks too loudly. Which is to say, I walked 2 blocks to the county recorder and filed a notice of interest, logged the suspected identity misuse with a sworn statement, and requested a temporary freeze on any conveyance actions naming me. Then, as a final quiet twist of the wrench, I sent a courteous, narrowly worded email to the Church Finance Committee requesting copies of any charitable disbursements made in my name during the years after Dad passed, because if my mother had been rearranging shells on the table, there would be a trail of pearl dust somewhere. I turned my phone back on as I stepped outside, and it vibrated with a call from a hidden number that I knew without asking, and when I answered, my mother's voice arrived low and even and almost tender as she said that I had no idea what my father left or why, and that if I kept poking around I would break something that could not be put back together, which would have sounded like a warning if not for the small, unmistakable tremor underneath, the one that told me I had finally touched the wire she never thought I would find. The house looked smaller than I remembered, though I suspected that was not the fault of the building, but of the years I had spent distancing myself from it, shrinking its importance in my mind so I could survive the constant comparisons that had clung to me like wallpaper ever since childhood. When I stepped into the garage, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of motor oil, and I felt the same unease I used to feel when my father asked me to hand him tools, and I would always choose the wrong wrench, only for him to smile gently and show me the right one, in sharp contrast to my mother, who never missed an opportunity to point out a mistake. I knew exactly what I was looking for because the voicemail from an old family friend had mentioned that my father used to keep a red folder, hidden where my mother rarely ventured, and sure enough, tucked behind a box of Christmas ornaments and a stack of yellowed magazines, I found it. The folder was stiff and stained at the edges, but the clasp still snapped shut like it had been guarding something important for far too long. I carried it to my car because I did not trust the silence of that house, and when I finally sat with it open in my lap, the papers inside told a story nobody had ever intended me to see. The first was an amendment to my father's trust, hand-signed and witnessed, naming me specifically as the beneficiary of a scholarship fund refund that should have been returned when I chose a cheaper university program. The second was a series of bank statements, years old, showing small withdrawals made under my name with notations that did not match anything I had ever signed, and the third was perhaps the most damning. A photocopy of ledgers from the Church Finance Committee where my mother had served as treasurer, with lines highlighted that looked suspiciously like disbursements recorded as charitable donations, but redirected in ways that suggested personal use. My hands trembled as I shuffled the pages because I realized this was not just negligence or favoritism. This was deliberate misdirection, an entire financial scaffolding built using my name as the invisible beam. I thought back to the countless times my mother told me I should be grateful that Ava got more help because she was more fragile, more sensitive, more in need of security, and I realized that behind that justification there had always been a darker truth. My stability had not been praised, it had been exploited. My independence was not a gift, it was a cover, an excuse to strip me of rights in silence, while they told me I was too strong to care. The first wave of anger passed quickly, replaced by the meticulous instinct I had trained into myself, and I photographed every page carefully, storing them in encrypted folders, backing them up twice, and emailing them to a trusted account only I controlled. Then I drove directly to the church, walked into the side office with the bland smell of coffee and hymnals, and quietly requested a copy of the committee's financial audits for the past decade, framing it as a personal review to ensure no identity issues had crept into the records. The secretary gave me a look that said she knew there was more to this than I was admitting, but she handed me the forms anyway. Filing the request was not dramatic, not the kind of revenge you can tell stories about at reunions, but it was exact, legal, and irreversible, and I knew that once an audit was triggered, The evidence would crawl into the light whether my mother cried or screamed or pretended to faint at the kitchen table. That night, when I returned home and spread the photocopies across my desk, I received a text from Ava asking if I could meet her tomorrow because Mom was unraveling. She said Mom had whispered something strange after a tense call. I did it to keep her safe from what I did to you, and Ava wanted to know what that meant. My heart clenched because it suggested layers I had not even considered. The possibility that my mother had used my name not only for money, but also to shield Ava from consequences she had earned herself. The thought was dizzying, a mixture of betrayal and grim curiosity, and I stared at the folder again, wondering how many stories were still trapped inside those pages. The cliffhanger hung there, heavy and undeniable. If my mother had done all of this to protect my sister, then what exactly had she done to me? And how much of my life had been rewritten by her hand before I even had the chance to live it? Ava insisted we meet at the house because Mom had been pacing since dawn and talking to the oven like it might answer, and while every part of me wanted to keep my distance from that kitchen and its choreography of control, I agreed. Not because I was ready to forgive anything, but because some conversations only make sense when they happen in the rooms where the first versions were written. So I drove over in the late afternoon with the red folder in my bag and a calm I built plank by plank. During the ride, the kind that looks like indifference from the outside, but is really just a refusal to bleed where someone expects blood. Mom was at the sink again, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands wringing a dish rag that did not need wringing, and when she saw me she smiled the way people smile in church lobbies, a polished expression that slides on easily and hides almost nothing. Then she asked if I was ready to talk like we had simply had a small misunderstanding, like I had stormed out over. The salt and not an insult sharpened across decades, and I said I was here to listen, which was true and also not the mercy she thought it was. We sat at the table without food because even she seemed to understand that a casserole would be theatrical, and when Ava slipped into a chair with a nervous little nod, I opened the folder and laid out the copies like playing cards, each one a hand she had not expected me to hold, and then I asked the question that had worn a groove in my mind since the night before, the question that carried equal parts dread and stubborn hope, which was what exactly she had meant when she told Ava she did it. To keep me safe from what she did to her. For a long minute she looked at the ledger copies as if the ink might rearrange into a better story, and then her shoulders loosened in a way that felt more like surrender than exhaustion, and she told us in a low, very steady voice that years ago, after Ava rear-ended a man in a parking lot while texting a client and driving without active coverage because the payment was late, she panicked, made 2 calls, and ended up filing a claim under my name by moving details around, saying the driver on the policy had been me because I had the clean record and because I would not, in her words, make a scene. I sat perfectly still because stillness is its own kind of fire, and I let her continue, and the rest spilled out with the strange calm people use when they describe a tornado as an unfortunate breeze. A chain of decisions that included a corrected statement to the insurer that only half-corrected anything, a new small line of credit to cover the remainder framed as a stopgap, and later, when the boutique faltered, an extension using the house as collateral in a package whose language was so dense she assumed I would never read it, all of it built on the assumption that my stability was a resource she could harvest indefinitely and my silence a given she could spend like cash. She said she had wanted to protect Ava from a premium spike at the start and from collapse later, that she had always planned to unwind it when things improved, that she believed it was all a family matter and not theft. And I watched Ava's face flicker between gratitude and horror as if her expression could not decide which version of daughterhood to perform. There are moments when anger arrives with symbols, and there are moments when it arrives like snowfall, cool and relentless, covering everything in a quiet that feels like clarity, and this was the second kind, so I asked Mom why the church ledgers were involved. And she said something about timing and reimbursements and how charitable accounts could be flexible when emergencies stacked up, and that was when I understood she had built a life raft out of other people's trust and then told herself that because she was a good swimmer it didn't count as stealing, and I realized I could stand here all day weaving empathy around the explanation, and it would still be a rope, and I was done being the knot at the end. I did not shout, I did not cry, I did not threaten, because threats are currency in her world and I have retired from that economy. Instead, I executed the kind of revenge that leaves a mark precisely because it refuses spectacle. Which is to say, I opened a small velvet box I had brought with me and set it in the center of the table, and when Ava reached for it with a question already forming, I told her I had spent the morning at a pawn shop reclaiming the gold locket our grandmother left her. The one that disappeared during the year the boutique bled cash, and Mom swore it was probably lost in a move, and I placed the receipt on top with a yellow sticky noting the case number associated with the identification presented at the time of the pawn, and then, very gently, I said that I wanted Ava to have her things under her own name and to understand that I would no longer be the silent cosigner on anyone's future, not because I wished her harm, but because love without boundaries is not love. It is consent to disappear. Ava's eyes flooded in a way that did not look like performance, and for a flicker of a second I felt the old instinct to soften, to translate, to make this ugly music sound prettier, but I kept my hands clasped and let the silence do its work. And when Mom finally spoke, it was with that careful lawyerly phrasing she uses when church people are listening, saying that my behavior had become aggressive and destabilizing and that I was harassing her with insinuations that could damage her reputation, and before I could answer, my phone buzzed with an email notification, the subject line a cold little drumbeat against my ribs, informing me that a petition had been filed for a temporary restraining order with claims of harassment and financial interference to be reviewed first thing in the morning, which was either a bluff dressed as paperwork or the opening act of something she never imagined I would be prepared to fight. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, not the echoing stage I had imagined, but a box of beige walls, humming lights, and a judge who looked like he had heard every variation of family tragedy and financial betrayal 1,000 times before, and maybe he had. Because when he read through the restraining order petition that my mother had filed, his expression didn't flicker, though I noticed his pen paused for the smallest moment on the phrase where she accused me of harassment through manufactured documents and destabilizing claims. I had come prepared, not with speeches or righteous anger, but with a folder that contained every photocopy, every screenshot, every notarized affidavit. And I placed it on the desk with the quiet certainty of someone who had finally learned that silence could be sharper than accusation. My mother sat opposite me in a pale blazer, hair perfect, tissues tucked into her sleeve like she had planned her performance down to the props, and beside her Ava looked pale, torn between loyalty and shame, her hands twisting a bracelet that I recognized as the very one our grandmother had promised me. A detail that would have gutted me years ago but now only felt like another piece in the long puzzle of how easily I had been edited out of my own story. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice, because I understood that drama was her weapon and mine was precision, so I laid out the certified letter, the ledger copies, the insurance claim anomalies, the pawn receipt with my sister's locket, and then the audit request I had filed with the church, explaining in careful sentences that my concern was not vengeance, but identity protection, that any adult in this position would have taken the same steps, and that if my mother saw that as harassment, it was only because the paper trail reflected choices she wished I had never uncovered. The judge looked at her then, his face unreadable, and after a pause that stretched long enough to make her shift in her seat, he dismissed the petition with the kind of finality that carried no warmth, just a clean slash through her attempt to weaponize the system. I thought that would feel like victory, but what settled into my chest was not triumph, but a kind of exhausted relief, the knowledge that one battle was closed even though the war beneath it still rumbled. Afterward, Ava pulled me aside into the hallway, her face pale but set, and she handed me a thin white envelope she said Mom had kept hidden in the desk drawer of her bedroom. An envelope addressed in my father's handwriting and sealed with tape that had yellowed at the edges. She whispered that she couldn't carry the weight of it anymore, that Mom had sworn her to silence, but she couldn't stand watching us tear each other apart while something written for me sat unopened. And then she pressed it into my hands and walked away before I could ask anything more. I stood there in the corridor with the envelope trembling like a live wire, knowing that whatever it contained might undo or confirm everything I thought I understood. And when I finally opened it at home that night, sitting at my kitchen table with only the hum of the refrigerator for company, the words shook me more than anything my mother had said, because my father had written with a foresight that bordered on prophecy. He told me that he knew the balance of love in our family was uneven, that he had tried to correct it through the trust, but feared that my mother would not honor his intentions, and that I would need to be stronger than fairness if I wanted to hold on to myself. He admitted that he had left certain assets in forms that only I could claim because he had seen how easily she blurred lines, and he warned me, in simple but devastating language, that resentment would always disguise itself as protection when spoken in her voice. He ended with one sentence that has not left my mind since I read it. She will tell you it was for your safety, but what she really means is that you were the only one she could afford to lose. I sat with that line long into the night, feeling both vindicated and gutted because it explained everything and excused nothing, and it left me staring at the truth with no clear instruction about what to do next. My revenge, if that word even applied anymore, was not fire or scandal, but the steady act of redirecting what funds I could recover into a small scholarship named for him, a way of ensuring that his intentions were not completely erased. And I invited Ava to help oversee it, not as an absolution, but as an open door to accountability, because I wanted her to face the same paper I had faced and decide what story she would write with it. As for my mother, she has not called since the hearing, though I hear from neighbors that she tells anyone who will listen that I have become cold and cruel, that success has hardened me, that I betrayed the very woman who carried me. And I let her tell it because I have learned that truth does not always win in the stories people repeat, but it wins in the records, in the ledgers, in the signatures that don't match. Still, some nights I find myself replaying her words at that table, the declaration that I would never be as pretty or successful as Ava, and I wonder if she said it not to wound me but to remind herself, to justify the years of carving pieces out of me in order to build a safer world for my sister. The thought lingers, unsettling and unresolved, and I know it will follow me for a long time, because some questions are not answered with evidence, but with the silence that comes after everyone else has left the room. And so the story ends not with a slam of the gavel or a shouted confession, but with me holding a letter that both explained everything and left me with more questions than I can name. A letter that reminds me every day that survival in my family was never about beauty or success, but about who could bear being invisible the longest without disappearing entirely.